For Chapter 3, let's talk about culture and media. Which comes first, culture or media? In a sense, it's difficult to figure out the answer to that question because they interact with one another so much. Sociologists would end up arguing that culture is part of the mirroring that goes on, but that it in turn reflects back. So think of it, think of culture as being something that creates a feedback loop between that and mass media. What does culture mean? Well, as a working definition, consider culture as people minus nature, since it consists of a set of beliefs, traditions, and practices. So, for one thing, culture is a human artifact. It's not something that occurs in nature per se. Perhaps culture could exist if we had an individual in isolation, but the common thread clearly is of a human. In fact, you can make the argument that culture amounts to a domination by people of nature, where it's something that talks or generates things like belief systems, such as religions, ideologies, such as political parties, symbolic representations, like the idea of having someone be a professor by the fact that he or she dresses up as a so-called professional, or anything else that is artificial. The bottom line, I think, is that when calling culture an artifact, it's clearly a creation of humans, both in terms of what they want from it and how they end up using it. You can even go one step further and argue that culture constitutes the actions of the superior over the inferior. The idea is that cultures may very well, in a cultural clash, consider theirs to be a particularly superior kind of a culture. There's a couple kinds of instances of this kind of belief called ethnocentrism. For example, if you look at the European colonization of North America, some came to this particular nation with an expectation that the people who were indigenous here lacked something. The phrase was, at that time, godless heathens. And so some, on religious grounds, felt that these individuals lacked something unless they were converted to a particular faith. So it presumes, of course, that the faith of the superiors, in this case the colonizers, was better than that of the inferiors, which would be the indigenous peoples. Although, to be honest, the difference between superior and inferior seems in part dependent upon superior technology. That and a few improvements in European stock, so that Europe, having gone through some of the major illnesses like the Black Plague, you might have seen more likely than a resistance to certain diseases, where the indigenous populations of North America, for example, lacked that immunity because they were not exposed to those diseases. Another way to think of culture is to think of it as man over machine. Very much this is something that people create, even though we may have some sort of means of generating culture. We have reference in the materials to Matthew Arnold, who sees it in terms of culture as being a pursuit of perfection and a broad knowledge of the world. The thing with Arnold's definition is that it attempts to contrast with the argument previously that you'd see a superior culture prevailing over an inferior culture. Rather than, it suggests a certain measure of openness or receptiveness to other possibilities, so that it eschews the sense of self-centeredness and material gain, and sees that culture is a pursuit of intellectual refinement, so that any encounter with other cultures benefits the person who is engaged in the encounter. It means this individual, by dint of exposure, has come to understand just a little bit more about the world. And in that view, every culture will have something of value that the person will, in some ways, learn from not just the culture, but about people in general. This is also an idea that was advocated centuries earlier in Plato's work, The Republic, where the ideal is something that is separate from the real world, so that you'd have the idea of attempting to search for or to discover that which is perfect. Plato talked a lot about the difference between what we see as imperfect and what exists as being perfect. Perhaps one of the things that Plato is best remembered for is the so-called parable of the caves, which is really a kind of a story to bring across a point that Plato wanted to make. He suggested a thought exercise where we have individuals looking into a cave. In the back of the cave there are shadows that are moving, because it turns out that below the back of the cave, in front of the back of the cave, is a shaft, and at the bottom of the shaft is a fire. Further, that there are individuals in front of the fire. But so Plato argues that what we see on the back of the cave are the shadows from the individuals down below being marked or shown on the back of the cave. But you know from experience that light from fire will vary quite a bit because of the nature of how fire burns. You'll also see the ways in which the people at the bottom of the shaft are moving around the fire so that the shadows would move, and you're having this being projected on the back of a cave, which will be rough-hewn. Plato's point in this metaphor is that at best we get an approximation of what is perfect, and so I think that Plato wishes to make the point to try to keep us rather humble about our understanding of what exists and what doesn't exist. In a discussion of culture, consider the ideas associated with material versus non-material culture, or culture that ends up being something that you would notice as being different if you're in a different place. Non-material culture pretty clearly will be something that's intangible, but this could include things like values or beliefs, social norms, or other types of behavior. While material culture will be something that is part of our constructed environment, something like technology. And even there you can have a relationship between material versus non-material culture. So for example, if you look at the people who live often in western Pennsylvania and parts of Ohio, which sometimes are referred to as the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Amish, their religious beliefs require them to avoid using modern technology, and also to avoid certain instances of a culture. For example, their garments are not held together by buttons because they believe they came to this country in reaction to, I believe, the experiences that they had had back in Germany, and that the individuals whom they saw as oppressors had bright buttons on their garments. So this is a sort of a political statement on their part. We'd end up seeing these things coming about linguistically. One of the things that talks about or reflects the idea that language has certain values or meaning to it is the Sapir-Whorf thesis, that language is a reflection upon the world in which it exists. So we'll see people talking about certain circumstances that reflect their environmental conditions. And while it may be the case that the cultures of the people who live closer to the Arctic Circle may have 30 different words for snow, that may not be unique to those particular cultures, but it does reflect the fact that given its proximity to northern climate, they may have the kind of winter that gives them an opportunity to learn quite a bit about snow. And so if you move to different parts of the world, you'll see a similar sophistication in that particular language over a particular topic. This is where at least part of the Sapir-Whorf thesis works, so that whatever we talk about reflects these sort of things. Understand, too, that culture is made up of things like race, class, gender, and inequality, that all of those are social constructs. that, for example, race ends up being a useful means by which we can then deprive people of certain rights, even going so far as to consider those people as commodities which can be bought and sold. That gender may seem to be one or the other, but in fact that there may be quite a very few variations on gender, even if you argue that gender is anchored in some sort of biological basis, you'll still see a great deal of variety in that count. Think about class. We supposedly live in a classless society. Perhaps it's not as demarcated as in the United Kingdom, where class distinctions are more sharp, or in India, a former colony of the United Kingdom. And partly with those kinds of classes, people are not given the opportunity to rise above it, to be able to move up a class. Arguably, no one in this country faces this, but as a practical matter, some people will not escape their particular class. And finally, inequality, whether you want to define it in any of the previous terms or in some other way, you'll find that even the notions of inequality will end up changing. Let me pause here to make the second of the Chapter 3 videos.